Hello, this is James Barkell and you are listening to the Coach Doctor podcast. In today's episode, I chat with Professor Shane Pill from Flinders University in South Australia. Shane is one of the leading experts and researchers in coaching and sports education. Shane was recently awarded the President's Award by the Australian Council for Health, Physical Education and Recreation for distinguished service to the profession. He discusses his transition from physical education teacher in the 1980s to his role researching coaching pedagogies and specifically the game sense approach to coaching and teaching sport. He discusses the differences between pedagogical models of teaching skills through games and highlights the requirements for struggle to promote growth and development. Shane is a wealth of knowledge in this area and his explanations will hopefully go towards coaches being able to apply some of the methods he discusses to build more resilient and skillful athletes. This podcast will be presented in two parts due to the length of the discussion. I hope you enjoy this chat with Professor Shane Pill. Shane, thank you so much for joining us on the Coach Doctor podcast today. Tell me a little bit about your background initially as a PE and science teacher and how this led to your role with Flinders University today.
It's a long story given my age now. I started teaching in 1988, got a job over the phone and moved to Perth because there was an expanding population and opportunities over in Perth. When I began my PE degree, the head of school said to us on day one, "You'll love this degree, but there's not many jobs for PE teachers at the end of it in South Australia." And that was certainly true with probably half of my graduating class moving interstate and many more of them moving to the country in order to get work straight off the degree. Spent 8 years in Perth, and it was while I was in Perth in the early 1990s, I was introduced to some of Rick Charlesworth's ideas during an AFL Level 2 coaching course, and his notion of designer games, which was then a bit later on published in the old Sports Coach magazine. If you were nationally accredited sports coach, you had access to the Sports Coach magazine, which was published by the Australian Sports Commission and came out periodically. Also went to a school professional development by a guy by the name of Les House, who was heavily influenced by the Teaching Games for Understanding model. And my head of department happened to have been trained in the UK. So I came out with these high set induction, very structured classes, the way I'd been taught at Teachers College. And Brian had come out and start every lesson with a game. And while I don't think that our outcomes in terms of skill development were any different at the end of our units of work, I'd watch his classes and go, I want to be in that class. And so I'd start having a chat to Brian around what he was doing, why he was doing it, in his philosophy, and his ideas married up with the ideas that were coming out from Rick Charlesworth's designer games approach, which were lining up with what Les House was talking about from his moving games approach, I think it was called. And then not long after that, the game sense approach was trialled, and there were national workshops all around Australia. And I thought, I'm going to give this a go. So it's during that period from about 1992 through to 1995. I started giving the game sense ideas a go in my first 18 football coaching. And then when the national curriculum was released and we were a trial school and an inquiry orientation was an obvious emphasis in that new curriculum, I thought the game sense approach was a really good pedagogical vehicle for that inquiry emphasis, and started to play around with the game sense approach in my secondary PE teaching. So that's how I got into the idea of game-based approaches. And because I work in Australia, I've always taken the lead from the game sense approach because it's the Australian model, and it's still the one that the Sport Australia website talks about for its sporting schools of programs and being aligned with the philosophy of playing for life. Came back to Adelaide in 1996, and the school that I was working at had a bit of a turnover in the health and PE department. And at 30 years of age, I was the oldest member of the department, and the young phys ed teachers were looking to do something different in what was a school that was really hard to engage the kids, low socioeconomic background, high number of new arrivals, English as a second language with about 60% of the population, significant social disruptions in many of the families. And they wanted to do something differently because the kids weren't engaging in PE or school sport. I had 4 kids out of a class of about 52, so about 52 year 12s in 1996, of which 4 were doing year 12 PE. When I left the school 6 years later, we had 22 kids enrolled in year 12 PE out of a 54 year 12 cohort. So significant improvement. And that was all brought about because we adopted the game categories model of the game sense approach, adopted a game-based teaching perspective based on the game sense approach. And we found our school sports teams started to get more numbers. We got elective program of phys ed in year 9. We got a second semester of PE at year 11, and kids had more confidence in their competence and started to play more sport for school and started to choose year 11 and 12 physical education as their elective subject as a consequence. So I felt we'd achieved something special at that school. Then moved into a deputy principal role and still managed to teach PE a couple of days a week, which was unusual. The principal would often rib me because I'd be wearing my PE gear and be going, "Where's the tie and the jacket? And that's a PE day today." And after 4 years of that, I decided that it wasn't really the direction I wanted to go in. I think I would have enjoyed being a principal, but I wasn't enjoying the role of being a deputy principal. And reflected that when I had felt most joy was as a head of department working with curriculum, and I wanted to get back into that. A job came up at Flinders University when I was in that scouting around phase of, is there an opportunity to move back into more teaching focused role, and applied for it, and was lucky enough to be successful. And I've been at Flinders University now for 16 years. So after 18 years in the classroom, now 16 years in teacher education and sport coaching.
Wow, that's a long time.
Oh, don't say that. It makes
sorry.
me feel old.
I didn't mean it. I didn't. Oh, sorry. It does sound terrible, doesn't it? But I didn't realise that. I guess the game sense approach had been around for that long. I didn't realise that, back in the 90s when you started implementing it, that it was something that was already on the radar. Was it very commonly known back then, or was it something?
It feels like it was. Yeah, it feels like it was more commonly known through the late 1990s into the early 2000s than what it is now. I think many PE teachers and sports coaches would see it still as an innovation in the sense that it's not new, but it's new to them. And partly the reason for that is that there's been a proliferation of other game-based approaches. People have come in from overseas with the ideas that are similar, but come from maybe a different theoretical perspective. But when you look at them being delivered, the pedagogy looks the same as a game sense approach. And that's okay. That's the way things go. That similar things get different brands depending upon where they are and what their backstory is. But now there are competing pedagogical models, both in the research and in the translation of the research into practice. And often the sports language reflects the skill acquisition expert that happens to be consulting with them. Skill acquisition as a sports science discipline didn't exist when I graduated from Teachers College in the late 1980s. My second year at Teachers College was the first year that the School of Physical Education had a sports science degree, and they were hunting around trying to find people to fill up the numbers for it. They were coming to us and going, "Are there any you phys editors that would like to transfer across to this new thing we call sports science?" Because they were struggling to get 20 odd for a cohort. Because back in those days, all the fitness people, all the skill acquisition people, they were all phys editors. They'd all done an education degree, and they all thought like educators, unless they'd gone overseas and maybe to the States and done a master's degree in kinesiology or something. The locals were all ex-phys ed teachers or current phys ed teachers. And when you referred to someone as a phys editor, it could be the fitness instructor, it could be the sports coach, it could be the person doing the data analysis. And so now we have a field of itself called skill acquisition, and it looks to a different tradition and set of theories to explain the whys, hows, and whats of what it does to what someone who's trained in education would be taught to think about things. So there's been some washout, there's been some slow uptake, there's certainly been a change in leadership across sports. So in the mid 2000s to the late 2010s, working with national sports, those people came through their sporting pathways when the game sense approach was being trialled, when it was being released, when the articles were in the Sports Coach magazine that was going out to all the nationally accredited coaches, and they were reading about the game sense approach. They were reading about the game sense trials that was being written into all the national sport coach education pathways. Those people have now retired, moved on, doing other things, so that institutional knowledge has also disappeared over time and been replaced with people who have been taught from a pedagogical lens what looks to be the same as a game sense approach, although from a theoretical lens might be explained very differently.
So I guess, obviously, from your main focus in teaching or lecturing at university is on the PE teaching pedagogies and sports coaching pedagogies, and obviously you've got a real passion for game sense. For anyone who's not really sure on what game sense is, can you explain the ideas behind it?
The game sense owes its tradition to a model called teaching games for understanding, which came into the literature in 1982 as a result of the write-up of a series of trials in game-based teaching that occurred in UK schools. The authors of the teaching games for understanding model, they had significant influence globally because their graduates took the ideas to the United States and it became the tactical games model. Rod Thorpe came out to Australia and worked with the Australian Sports Commission on his Churchill Fellowship trip, and they developed the game sense approach. The difference from a game sense approach to the teaching games for understanding model is the teaching games for understanding model has a 6-step process, and you follow the 6 steps in order. So while it's cyclical because it gets you from the game back to the game, it's still linear in the fact that it's got 6 steps. Tim Hopper, in a publication in the early 2000s, suggested that the teaching games for understanding model flipped the paradigm from drill to game, which was called a technical to tactical paradigm, to game, then maybe drill, then back to the game. So it flipped the technical to tactical to a tactical, then technical paradigm. Play first. And by playing first, you make obvious, apparent, and contextual the need for any drills that will then follow, because the game's made apparent where the development needs are for the players, either collectively or as individuals. The game sense approach is more iterative in the fact that it was never described with that model. I've got the game sense research report from the 1990s, and the description of the game sense approach in that research report is that you start with a game, or you make the game the focus of the training session. It doesn't preclude drills, but it asks the coach to seriously consider who needs to be drilled and when the drills need to occur. Drills are not the default setting, and the game becomes the reward at the end of training if you've done a good job and we've got time because we've finished the other stuff. Now, the game becomes the context, the focus of the practice session, because the game is the thing that we're trying to improve. If we go back decades before that, we look at the work of Alan Wade from the UK, and then Eric Worthington, who came out to Australia and became the first technical director of soccer in Australia. They promoted the idea of start training with small-sided games to make apparent what needed to be focused on for training, to bring in a higher training volume, because you're going to get more ball touches and more technical orientation and tactical thinking in a small-sided game than what you are in a large-sided game, which also corresponded to some of the stuff that I was reading in Rick Charlesworth's work, Horst Wine's work, and others globally around the best way to go about designing a practice session. So there was a lot of alignment in thinking through the 1990s into the early 2000s on what we might call more broadly a game-based approach.
One of the things that as a coach I'd find difficult is planning a session. You know exactly what's going to come up. If you went with that idea of programming a game as the main focus of your session, and then from that, you might identify that, there's passing is an issue or is a technical aspect of the game that's poor. So we might move into a passing drill. Is that a way you might look at it?
I think that's the way a novice might look at it. And it's a good entry point for starting to play around with the pedagogical ideas of a game sense approach. I think Eric Worthington in his 1974 book described it really well, and it's still the best way to go about it today. He talked about designing that first game so that you know the moment, the teachable moment that's going to occur, and you keep playing the game until that teaching moment occurs. So using Rick Charlesworth's language, you've deliberately designed the game knowing that this moment is going to occur, and when that moment occurs is when you come in for your teaching. So it's not just play a game. I use the phrase play with purpose because there was an interpretation of the game sense approach is play a game and see what happens. Like somehow by osmosis, something is going to happen and you'll be able to teach them something, or you just let them play, and just by letting them play, they'll be able to develop, which really is not logical. The kids and adults will learn by mimicry. So there's a conscious processing by observation of others, which leads them to try something new. That's what happens at the skateboard park. That's what happens when we watch someone on TV and decide to try to model that technique. It's mimicry, it's conscious behavior. The role of a coach is to be there to speed up that development by helping the action framework to provide cognitive organizers that help to improve that development. It's certainly not implying that there's a one-size-fits-all technical model, even though in most sports we can look at biomechanical markers that will lead to efficient and effective performance. Beyond biomechanical markers which lead to that efficient and effective performance, there's a lot of deviation in the movement models that can be successful in the practice of a game. But I come back to that point that the skilled practitioner has deliberately designed that opening game with a couple of purposes in mind. The first purpose could be retrieval practice, where they're actually using that first game engagement to test whether the players are where the coach thinks the players should be. Retrieval practice, bring them back into context. This is what our development focus is. This is where we're up to in our education, right? We're starting off by making sure that we bring that into focus before we bring in what's new to be learnt in that session. Or it's done to test and open up to the players exactly where the development needs to go, because the game has been designed, as I say, for that moment. And when that moment occurs, we predict the players will struggle with that moment. Through that struggle, we will get the new development. And we need to come in with our teaching once that struggle starts to occur.
With that aim of struggle in mind, do we produce games where it's the likelihood of that struggle is going to occur more commonly or occur more quickly than, say, just a general version of a game where it might occur? Is that something that we'd take into consideration?
Again, it comes down to the purpose for which the coach has decided that the game needs to be there. If it's consolidation, then the game will be within the challenge point of the players. If it's retrieval practice, then it will be within the anticipated challenge point of the players. If it's to stretch the players and open up where the game development or the education piece needs to go, then that elevated challenge point will provide some struggle. And it's through that struggle that we elevate the players' capability, because if they're doing what they can do and it's all looking nice and neat and it's all comfortable and it's all great, they're not being stretched, they're not developing, they're playing within their current toolkit of possibilities.
Yeah, no, it's very, very, very interesting. And you describe it really well. I really like the way you've phrased it, play with purpose, because there's obviously a purpose in the game that you're playing. And obviously that purpose is that aspect of struggle that they require to be able to learn to cope, to move on to that next phase. So yeah, really, really like that phrase, play with purpose. You describe game-based teaching or coaching as a toolkit of teaching styles. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Yes, my my colleague, and he's now become a good friend, Brendan Susi, who, ex-phys ed teacher for, about 18 years like myself, and then did a PhD, had some questions and moved into teacher education, who hit me up at a conference and he said, Pilly, you've been describing the game-based approach, the game sense approach as guided discovery. And so have a few other people. I don't reckon it is guided discovery. It's not guided discovery because I see very few teachers and coaches going in with a pre-planned set of questions to lead to a discovery moment. He said, mostly what I see is ad hoc questioning in the moment that is drawing on players' existing cognitive understanding. So mostly what the coaches are doing through their questioning is asking the players to remember. It's not guided discovery. There is no creativity. There is no transfer. It's remember this and explain it. So it's retrieval practice. And wow, that really challenged me. And I thought about it a lot. And I came to the conclusion that he was right. This process of truly guiding discovery needs to be carefully planned for and is a highly structured series of questions that leads to a predetermined knowledge outcome, step by step. And very few coaches spend the time to actually plan for that. They certainly don't spend the same amount of time, in my observation, as they do planning the activities that they want to do. So then, Brendan invited me to co-write with him on a paper where he had taken a couple of the ideas that I had in the Play with Purpose resource and had described initially as guided discovery, and opened them up as a pedagogical toolkit using Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles. So when we put Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles against the language that was being used, we saw that mostly a game-based approach is practice style pedagogy, because the teacher or the coach has set the learning objective. The teacher or the coach has designed the conditions of the game, or if you come from an ecological perspective, has designed the constraints under which the players are performing. So the coach or the teacher has done the pre-planning, the coach or the teacher has done the impact, and then the coach or the teacher is doing the post-impact inquiry, the reflection through the questioning. So that's very coach-centered, even though it's often described as player-centered, because the players haven't had any say in the planning of it, the impact of it, or the reflection on it. It's practice style. I'm not suggesting that that's not appropriate, far from it. It's just that from a Mostyn spectrum of teaching styles, a game-based approach turns out to be mostly practice style engagement with some moments of discovery episodes. And the other thing that Brendan really helped me understand is if I ask a question to the group and I get the answer from a player, it's no longer discovery for the rest of the group because they've heard it. It's now to what degree have they understood it? So it's a form of retrieval practice, certainly elaboration and building on it, but it's no longer a discovery moment for the rest of the group. It was only a discovery moment for the player that gave the answer. And the only way that we can know that it's a discovery moment for that player is if we have some insight into their cognitive architecture and their cognitive frameworks. That means we have to have pre-assessed our players to know what the development of their tactical capability, as much as we've pre-tested them to know the development of their technical capability. So, we often pre-test our players in pre-season in order to develop the challenge points, to develop the particular craft work that their development targets they're going to be on. We need to be testing their cognitive frameworks just as much as we are their physical frameworks, so that we can come in with game education that takes them to a more complete, a more sophisticated, a more knowledgeable. I'm not really sure what the right wording of it is, but in order to improve them, we need to know what their starting point is. And so we need to make their learning visible before we actually come in with the education pieces, and then continually through the education pieces, we need to be making their thinking visible in order to know whether there's any progress in their education.
Okay, that's a really interesting idea. Could you provide like an example of how that might work in terms of a pre-testing situation and then how it might work in a training scenario?
Yeah, good one. So
Am I
on the
throwing you under the bus
spot,
with that one?
oh, just a little bit, but that's okay. What came to mind as you were saying it was speaking to an AFL um, head of coaching development. He was describing how they had developed some black screen scenarios to test their players' tactical understanding. So they would be rolling out some vision and then black and going, what happens next? And they'll go, oh, I kick the ball to James. And then the vision rolls up and you kick the ball to Phil, who's on a 45-degree angle inside the corridor, and go, why didn't you choose that? And go, I didn't even see that. So part of it is, they don't have the perception in order to understand, if I use ecological language, the affordance. So therefore, with that particular player, in order to improve their decision-making, that tactical ability in the moment, we have to improve their capacity to take in relevant information. Now, that's one of the reasons why in talent identification in Australian football that I work in, we use the phrase, does the player have a swivel head? Are they actually actively scanning the environment, or are they got tunnel vision, just looking down the line? And, you look to the work of Daniel Mamertens, who says that that notion of tunnel vision often comes from the practice design the players have been in, where they only have one option, that marker, that cone, that pass. And so their perception isn't trained to scan the environment and select the best decision, because at training, they only ever have one decision, that one straight in front of them.
Yeah, okay. No, that's great.
That's how powerful coaching is. Coaching can either open up that capacity for decision-making through the knowledge that's available to the players in their environment, or shut it down. And once it gets shut down, we limit the capacity for action for that player, because they don't perceive the opportunities for action that another player that hasn't had the same training down the line. And that's why research in all sports tends to conclude that the players that are the best of the best have done exactly the same amount of physical education, have gone to the same amount of sports coaching, but the thing they've done more of in their youth is played games, and not necessarily the competitive games, backyard games, street games. In Australian football, often our elite midfielders were playing a lot of basketball during their juniors. Now, motion offense in basketball, pass and recycle, is exactly what we want to do around the contest in Australian football. So the brain of that basketballer, pass and recycle, pass and move, is exactly what we're trying to do with our midfielders in Australian football. So there's no coincidence that often our elite midfielders have had not just volume of football, but also volume of basketball in their performance histories during adolescence as well.
Yeah, no, fantastic. That you've explained that really, really well. So from a skill acquisition standpoint, does Game Sense offer the best form of contextual interference for athletes, as games are played in a highly randomized order and there's a lot of variability in the practice, or does it depend on the type of game being used, or am I completely off the mark?
Depends on the type of game being used. And again, whether the coach is setting up the game for that contextual interference or not. And that's why I use the phrase play with purpose. The game is a tool. The game is an educative environment. So it comes down to what purpose is the coach constructing that education environment. Now, if we want contextual interference for a particular learning effect, then we will design the game from a constructivist perspective. We'll talk about putting conditions in place. From an ecological perspective, we'll talk about putting constraints in place. But the game is designed for that outcome, because that's the learning effect the coach is trying to seek. So the starting point is actually the coach being really clear of the educative purpose. And that's why I use the phrase play with purpose, to come back to that all the time. The coach needs to be able to explain, this is the learning environment I'm establishing and the reason for it being established this way.
Okay, so is that explaining the why before the practice, explaining this is what we're aiming to look at, or are you being too explicit if we're saying that we're just giving a basic overview of what we're doing and then extracting, I guess, the information from the players when we see the aspects that we're looking for?
Yeah. All right. So I'm not a sports scientist, so I'll answer this using educational theory. And educational theory tells us that learning is accelerated if there is clarity on the learning objective. So therefore, one of the most powerful things that a coach or a teacher can do is to be explicit about what is to be learnt, why it is to be learnt, and what the expectations on learning are. I mean, you work in a tertiary setting. The reason why we have our whole curriculum, all our learning objectives, and all of our assessment clearly laid out week by week by week to the students at the start is not because we're a university. It's because that's best educative practice. To get the best outcomes for the students, they need to have clarity on what the learning expectations, journey, outcomes, how it's going to be measured are at the start. Now, if we want to empower the self-regulated, self-determined, independent learners, they need that so that they know what flight they're on. Yep. If we don't provide that to them, they're having to work at our pace because we're not releasing the roadmap to them. So from an educational theory perspective, we release the roadmap and be really, really clear what that roadmap is.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's great. I think a lot of people get a lot out of that idea. So what about game sense coaching? Is it basically the same as constraints-based coaching, or how do they differ, those two ideas?
My take on it, and I'm a pragmatist. So I'm not driven, my research is not about proving a particular theory. My research tends to be driven by teachers and coaches saying, I have this question. I go, okay, let's think about that and do an exploration. So I'm unusual in the fact that I've never had a research agenda. Things have just sort of happened. So I put that caveat out there. I'm not coming at this from skin in the game for a particular standpoint. From a pedagogical perspective, which is my lens on the world, because I'm pragmatic around this is what we need to do, so we need to package it up. When I've seen a constraints-led demonstration, it looks like a game sense approach. However, if we look at it now from a pedagogical perspective, a cornerstone of game-based approaches like the game sense approach is the deliberate modification of games to get the challenge point right for the players, whether that be because of their age or stage of development. And I also use the phrase, we modify that for the educative purpose. A constraints-led approach, which talks about the constraining of task performer or environmental constraints, to me has the same outcome as in the 70s when we were talking about deliberately conditioning a game by modifying its rules. It's the same thing. We are eliminating, we are reducing, we are exaggerating aspects of the game in order to magnify the player's intentions so that there becomes a focus clearly on what it is we want them to learn, or it's opening up the space for a conversation. So in a constraints-led approach, we may have the constraint that you get 3 points, but only if you hit the ball in front of this line, which brings us to the net. Because we want to encourage players to get to the net, so we will create a constraint that recognises that and rewards that in the game. In fact, from a constraints-led approach, we would probably say you only get 1 point if you play from here, but you get 3 points if you play from there. So we've constrained the type of scoring that you can do. So the task has been constrained, the environment has been constrained in order to try and encourage some problem solving, and we'll open up a conversation with the players along the line of when's the right time to come to the net? What are the affordances How do you recognize the affordances that create the opportunity that come to the net? We're doing exactly the same thing in the game sense approach, where we're modifying the game environment to encourage a particular behavior, exaggerating, modification by exaggeration, the number of points, 3 points if you win the rally from the net. And then we're having the same questions. When is the right time to play from behind that line and go for 1 point? When is the right time to come in front of that line and go for the 3 points? So from a pedagogical perspective, the idea of the constraints-led approach is a really effective way of explaining how game modifications work.
Okay. So I just going to ask a question regarding constraining the way games are played with using points. So I'll give you an example of a game that I've tried to play in rugby training, where I've maximised or provided more points if you score a try in one way and less points if you score a try in another way. And one of the problems then I've identified from doing that is then the players are automatically trying to score this specific way, knowing that that's going to create more points for them, even if, I guess, the affordance isn't there for them to try and do that. And they're not identifying that, hang on a minute, the space is still back here where I'm going to earn lower points. But even though that's probably the better decision, I'm going to then still try and make that higher point play. Does that make sense?
It does, but to me, that's opening up the educational conversations.
Yeah.
Right? At what stage of a game, even though the 1 point play is on and it's a higher percentage play, do you ignore the high percentage of play and go for the high reward, but also high risk play?
Yeah.
And so they start to actually understand a little bit about the moments. And yeah, you tell me this one. My observation of the Australian rugby team is they didn't take as many penalties as they should have early in the season, and they lost games because they weren't ticking over the scoreboard. They were trying to play attractive rugby and score. In the last 3 to 5 test matches, when the penalties have been on offer, they've taken them. And so they've kept the scoreboard ticking over. Consequence has been they've been in the games for longer. To me, it's the same thing, knowing the moment.
Yeah.
Knowing what's the decision in the moment. And if we're not giving them the opportunity to explore, okay, you had that there, you went there, it didn't come off. What's the consequence?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that the outcome we want in the game? What's that now created for us as a team? The fact that you didn't take the easy option, you went for the hard option, wasn't on, but all you had was maximum points, wasn't on. What's that done now to our team?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a great learning opportunity then, isn't it, really?
Great learning opportunity.
Yeah.
Allow it to happen, because it's in the happening that we'll get the wisdom of this is the time, this is not the time.
Yeah, okay. No, thanks for explaining that one as well. I think any coaches, whether they be grassroots coaches or elite level coaches, would be getting a lot out of some of these ideas and I guess some of the explanation around some of those ideas as well, Shane. So thank you. You've worked with a number of different sporting organisations, from, I guess, AFL being one of your main sports, to the rugby codes, to cricket, tennis, so striking games. How do different sports perceive game sense coaching and generally apply it? And so, for example, for me, teaching cricket bowling, which is a very discrete skill, how could you use or utilise game sense in coaching a skill like that as a cricket coach? So I probably asked too many questions there, but...
No, I get it. I'll use the cricket example. So I had the good fortune through a New Colombo mobility plan, Australian government New Colombo mobility plan, had funded scholarships for a number of our sport degree and phys ed students to go to India. And as part of our first trip to India, we were working with, I think it was called Mulholland Cricket Club in Mumbai. And, cricket, to me, cricket provides efficient practice, but it's not effective because the practice conditions in the nets don't replicate the games. And so the first thing that we did was we had the batters batting in pairs. And then we put witches' hats in the nets. So we asked the bowlers to set their field. And the batters, if they hit between the markers, had to use their kinesthetic feedback on their shot and call, was it a 1, a 2, a 4, a 6, a 3? But they would just rotate the strike. So the strike was rotating, but they weren't actually doing the runs. And I can remember the captain for the under-18s, and who was apparently their best batter, first ball, he's cracked this ball, chest height to gully, right, a witch's hat. And I called out first ball, rotate the strike. He said, what are you talking about? Hit it beautifully. Yeah, straight to gully, chest height, out first ball, rotate the strike. Okay, get it now. So there, we're trying to replicate or represent, if you want to use ecological language, the type of environment for the type of thinking that you would in a game. Hit the gaps, or when you go over the top. So therefore, I then put a line on there and said, righto, the field's up except for, where I've left the gap. So if you hit above that line, it's gone over. You're not going to be out. If you hit it to the marker, but it's over this net line, it's off to the boundary. Oh, okay. So that encouraged a different strike as well. Now we went to the bowlers and I said, what's your bowling plan? He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, you're working as a bowling team. You have a bowling plan on Saturday, right? Yeah. What's your bowling plan here? Get together, have a chat, work out your bowling plan. Then the next thing we did was we said, okay, when you bowl on Saturday, you bowl 6 balls, then you have a break. Here, you're bowling 1 ball and you're having a 3-ball break. Then you bowl on another ball, having a 3-ball break. It's not the same as a game. Bowl 6 balls, have a break. And so we only had 2 players in the nets. Those 2 bowlers would bowl their 4 to 5 overs while the others were out doing their fielding practice, and then they would rotate through, just like in a game. And those 2 bowlers that were coming in to bowl to those 2 batters had to have their tactical plan in place. Where were they trying to allow those players to hit, so they're setting their field, and where were they allowing a hit because they were trying to tempt them in order to get them out.
Nice.
So they had to have a bowling plan. So that's one way that in cricket we can bring a game sense approach, modifying purposefully the environment, making it more game-like. Cricket's a game that's played in pairs. You've got a bowling pair against a batting pair. So there's a game within a game.
Yeah.
And so we replicated that. So it can be done across sports. If you've got the opportunity to put in place the idea that Greg Chappell used at the academy, which was called Battle Zone, where he set small scale games of cricket basically inside the inner arc and had some sort of barrier there so that the ball just didn't go 100 metres and have to be chased, and the bowler had a bucket of balls and bowled that bucket of balls out, then that's great. But not every cricket club has access to that oval where they can set up a battle zone and get a 5, get a 6-a-side game of cricket going. I call it super sixes. So you've got a bowler, you've got 2 batters, you've got 2 off waiting to come on. So you've got 6 on the field and 2 off. And when those 2 batters come off, another 2 come off, get changed, they come on. So you've always got 2 waiting to go. Works really, really well in terms of a small-sided scale version of cricket, and you can get through a lot of representation of the game in a 2-hour practice session, hour and a half practice session, but you need the space to be able to do that. So the challenge is to turn our nets into something that's more like a cricket game.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So, and what about other sports? Do you find that there are some sports that are more open to, I guess, the idea of game sense than others, and have really taken it on? And also, I guess, within their coaching framework, that they've actually gone in as part of their coaching framework and coach education ideas or models, have really tried to push this idea of game sense coaching?
Yeah, sorry, that was the second part of your question. So it's, in my experience, it depends on who is in charge of education programs and coach development at both the national sport level and then at the state sport level. Depending upon if they come from skill acquisition or education, is where they will go to as their ideas. Around about 2006, I was brought into a project with Cricket Australia that was developing a game-based resource for generalist primary school teachers. And then when the person who commissioned that project moved on, the energy for that idea dissipated and the resource never really took off. But we took that idea, which was the school cricket resource, to Tennis Australia, gave them a pitch. They liked it, and it's now been they worked for nearly a decade on the tennis for primary schools and tennis for secondary school programs using a game sense approach as their model for resource development, and really ran with it. But then their education lead, Mitch Hewitt, he came from a teaching background. He knew the game sense approach and thought it was the absolute perfect vehicle to energise the teaching of tennis in schools, and through that resource also provide pedagogical direction to coaches around educatively purposeful practice as well. And it was a wonderful relationship between, university where the research is housed and the translation of the research into practice through the National Sporting Organisation. I still maintain that those resources that Tennis Australia produced, the primary school tennis for schools program and the secondary tennis for schools programs, are the best examples of sport education programs you'll see anywhere in the world. Not only could a classroom teacher pick it up and run with it, but if you were using that as your program model in a community tennis setting, you'd be more, I think you'd be accelerating the development of your players, and certainly I would think encouraging more players to stay in the game than what we see in a traditional drill-based practice model. So for me, it comes down to the person who's in charge, because they're the gatekeeper, they're the initiator, they're the stimulator, they're the people that have the key to the coin box and can release the money to make things happen. So my work with the AFL started because Laurie Woodman understood the game sense approach. He was really keen to see Australian football transform from lines, laps and lectures to a more game-based approach. It coincided with Alistair Clarkson talking about a need for football at all levels to play more games, and Hawthorn being tremendously successful, and Alistair Clarkson saying that's built on a philosophy of playing games with our players. I can't remember, I think it was 2015 AFL National Coaches Conference. I was fortunate to be one of the keynotes. I was the Saturday morning keynote. We ran a keynote and then out onto the oval and ran a practical to show the theory into practice. And the coach was mic'd up, I was mic'd up, and we did something similar at Subiaco Oval in 2016, where we were mic'd up and we actually put an under 16 team through a game-based practice session and talked about the how, the why, the what as the session was going on. But what helped was Alistair Clarkson on Friday night just stoling the virtues of a game-based approach of playing games and telling coaches they've got to play more games. So when I came to give my talk on Saturday morning, the preeminent coach of the time had already primed everybody's receptiveness to those ideas. A couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to run some workshops with the National Rugby League Coaches Conference, and there was great receptivity to the ideas, but I was surprised at how foreign the ideas were to many of the coaches. But that's still the same in Australian football, where I do most of the work, because they're largely volunteer coaches. They're not people that have come through a tertiary program on coach education, know what the current ideas are. They're replicating the coaching that they had. So if we want a different standard of coaching in Australia, we need to have more resources available to support the volunteer community coaches, because they're on the tools all day, they're in front of people all day. They just don't have time to be designing contemporary practice structures. So if we can actually give them a template, and here's all the activities. So I want to teach spreading a defence using the width of the field as my focus at training. Here's a series of activities, and I can just go to the website and go, that's number one, that's number two, that's number three. I've got repetition of the idea because they're all hitting the same idea, using width to spread the defence, to provide opportunities to go forward. Simple for me.
Yeah.
Simple for me. And I think that's eventually where we will go, and sporting organisations as resources providers starting to develop more of those templates. Dave Reynolds at the SANFL has developed some fantastic videos which are now uploaded onto Coach AFL, for example, that show game sense activities. So the coach is not just reading about it in a resource. There's a video there that shows what it looks like in practice. So there's a really good mental representation for the coach about how it should work. And therefore they've got more appreciation to go and do it because they've seen it. It's not just something in a book. It's not just an idea that they can dismiss. They've actually seen that it works, and it's not actually that difficult. A lot of the difficulty in a game-based coaching approach goes in the front end, where you have to put more thought into your planning. But actually, once training starts, you've got more time to sit back and do the observation, which is really where the educative purpose lies. Because if you can't sit back and do the observation, you don't know what education piece the individual players need.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of this intriguing chat with Professor Shane Pill. The next episode will be available shortly. In the meantime, 3 things that have really stood out for me are, firstly, the kids and athletes play sport for the game. The best way to prepare them for playing is by actually playing games, not by using one-dimensional training drills that require little or no decision making. Secondly, that a games-based approach has to be purposeful and provide meaningful learning opportunities. And lastly, athletes require some amount of struggle to learn and develop, but there has to be a struggle point. Too hard and we lose the athletes, too easy and the learning process is not effective. Thank you, and I'll be back with part 2 shortly.